you guys have been busy this last year. And let me follow up on the faith-based and nonprofit security grant program. You're right. Last year we finally got an authorization. The authorization was for less than the appropriated amount, actually, because there's such a concern about this and such a need for it. So the $90 million that we got into the budget last year for this fiscal year was an unprecedented amount, and it's needed. We have over 2,000 applications in 2019 that FEMA looked at. You were able to fund 718 of them. So I do think there is, based on the analysis we've done at least, there are a lot of applications you thought were good applications but didn't have the funding to be able to grant them. I'm a little confused about your answer on where the money is in the budget, because I don't see it either. And I know you support the program, and the President also signed the authorization, which I really appreciate. Right. I was the author of that authorization. We do have an increased level of hateful messaging, hateful crimes. We had bomb threats in Ohio 2 weeks ago. They were focused on the Jewish community, specifically some synagogues in Northeast Ohio. It's a reality. It's a sad reality, but not just in the Jewish community, but the Muslim community, the Hindu community, even the Sikh community. There have been some instances. So, and the Christian community. So, can you just more precisely tell me where the funding is coming from?
So the nonprofit security grant program is built within our larger FEMA grant program. Right. And I think it hasn't been a line item to date. We've continued to fund it year over year. The bill that the President signed that Congress passed, I think you'll see that in future budgets be a line item. Of course, that bill was passed well before the budget, or well after the budget was created.
It was passed at the end of the year.
For 21, correct. So, but we've continued to fund that. We fund that in the past, again, out of the larger pool of our FEMA grants. So it's there. It's just not a line item, so it doesn't show up specifically in the budget. But that's how we've continued to fund it, and I think you'll see that reflected specifically based on the legislation that was signed into law in future. So you
would expect. My understanding is that wasn't true with regard to previous budgets, but you're saying it's within the FEMA grant program, and you believe there's $90 million as Congress appropriated set aside for this fiscal year.
For 20 or 21?
For 20.
For 20, I will get you the exact, whether it's 60 or 90. I don't have that offhand, but I can certainly follow up with you on that.
And with regard to what the number ought to be in the future, there's been discussion of that. As you know, some members have made announcements that they think it ought to be a certain level. And as we've looked into those, it's hard to find what the justification is. In other words, what the basis is. It seems to me what it ought to be is, how many applications have come in, how you all have scored those applications, and I assume that there are, again, a number of them that were qualified, but you just didn't have the funds for, and that to me seems to be what ought to lead us in next year as we look at the appropriations numbers to determine what the amount is. Are you willing to help us with that?
We are, and again, back to the earlier question about grant funding, what we try to do is build up capacity. So what we're looking at is, houses of worship, is we're looking at those new houses of worship that need the grant funding to build up their capacity. So we continue to look at all our needs. I will say that we get requests that outpaced our resources each and every year for a number of our grant programs. We have resource constraints and have to make those decisions. But yes, we'll continue to work with Congress on what that right amount is.
I've been impressed with your people and also the FBI who have helped us back home in Ohio. We've had a conference, statewide conference, and a lot of good information was exchanged. Some of it, frankly, is just best practices. How to harden a facility, where the cameras ought to be, and where security guards should be posted. Right. We also appreciate the fact that last year you permitted for the first time armed security personnel to receive some of the funding, understanding you want that to be sustainable over time.
Right.
So I think we're making progress, but I just want to be sure that we come up with a number that makes sense, that is really meeting the need, because again, sadly, I think it's increasing. With regard to the coronavirus, we have obviously a lot of need out there. I'm just looking at the supplemental. We just got this a couple hours ago. This is the proposed supplemental, and Chairman Shelby and the Appropriations Committee sent it out. It looks like it has funding for what you would expect, HHS, NIH, and Food and Drug Administration to try to get some therapies out there, and there's State Department, USAID aid in here for foreign countries to be able to contain it more. Even SBA has some funding in here, but not DHS. Are you aware of that?
I am.
And why is that? And I assume you are playing a central role in this.
We are, and again, we've stood up a number of medical contracts. I will say, overall, we've spent somewhere between 12 and 13 million thus far on the department's response, and that was to stand up. So initial cost to stand up a lot of our processes that we see at our airports, land ports of entry. We think that's probably 2 to 3 million going forward per month. So it's not a big number for us when we look at whole of government response. So obviously we can sustain that funding level to a certain extent. We'll probably have to move some of our budget around this fiscal year to address that. But the administration wanted to focus this supplemental request obviously on the medical response. So again, as you indicated, most of that dollars is dedicated to HHS, CDC, and others inside the Department of Health.
Do you think under your current TSA budget, for instance, you have adequate funding to be able to respond to the crisis?
We do. We have adequate funding today to do that, not only to continue our medical contracts, our medical screening that we're doing at the 11 airports, but also so the protective measures and protective wear, PPEs, that we are providing our workforce as well.
Finally, on the issue of China and these talent programs, as you know, the subcommittee called Permanent Subcommittee Investigations of this committee spent a year looking at these programs, decided that in a shocking report that we had virtually done nothing for 2 decades to keep Chinese programs like this from taking our research, commercializing it in China, sometimes military, sometimes economic. And we're coming up with legislation shortly to deal with that a lot of members of this committee will be part of. But one thing that I wanted to ask you about is how can you help us more to identify people who are coming over to the United States from China in particular, although other countries are involved as well in trying to get our taxpayer-paid research.
Sure.
And specifically members of the Chinese military who have come over here for conferences, for university visits, and it seems to me that there's a pretty clear intent with a number of these individuals to obtain research while they're here and take it back.
Right.
Have you looked into this issue, and what do you think DHS should be doing we're not doing?
Well, absolutely. So part of that's an intel issue, but it's also there's a number of visa programs that USCIS administers that we see perhaps have some that have been abused over time. That we see a lot of students on certain visas for an extended periods of times from China, but also from other countries that perhaps there are so large, it's very difficult for us to monitor those individuals. So we are working through a number of those visa programs. Happy to talk to you and the committee about how do we root out some of the abuse of those programs while retaining the ability to bring over the best and the brightest to continue to fuel the economy, but make sure that we do that in a smart way.
And we wondered that we want to have appropriate exchanges, but I would just say that I think this committee would be interested in helping you if you're looking for additional expertise, resources to identify these individuals, because this is a growing threat, and obviously the problem is it's getting a lot more attention. You, as I understand it, are about to disband your Homeland Security Academic Advisory Council. I would just warn against that and instead use it for this purpose, because the relationship you have with our higher ed partners is really important for us to be able to deal with this issue, and I think that council could be a good forum.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator